Hello everyone. This video is to cover a very important topic in African American history. As you can see on the screen, we're going over the Civil War. This event is of huge importance to not only the United States and its history, but African Americans and their history. It does cover a lot of information. It does talk about a lot of different facets of the war, specifically the roles African Americans played in the war, how they were treated by both the Union and the South. And because of that, it does have a lot of information. It's going to be a pretty long video. I'm actually going to split it into two sections. And so let's go ahead and start with the first section. So again, this is African Americans and the Civil War. So the first thing that we have to cover that is obviously crucially important when we're talking about this is what the cause of Civil War is. Now, historically, this is not really something that was debated. It is not something that should be debated. Historically, this is an event that isn't... that we don't need to debate. The cause of the Civil War is slavery. People at the time were clear of this issue. You learned about this in your assignment that you've already done. Post-war, a lot of effort is going to go into changing this thinking, it's going to go into changing the thinking, but it's not something that's going to happen during the time. So this is after the war, and we'll talk about those efforts at a later time. Not all Southerners own slaves. We've said this before, but all are benefiting from a society that runs on slavery. And so therefore, when they fight for their way of life, they're fighting for a way of life that is provided for by slavery. When they are fighting for their homeland, they're fighting for a homeland that is protected by slavery. When they are fighting for their economy, they are fighting for an economy that is run by slaves. When they are fighting for states' rights, they are fighting for the right to own slaves. So slavery is the cause of civil war. Now, while it is the cause, it doesn't mean that everyone is fighting for it. It doesn't mean that it is the cause people are fighting for, right? But it causes us to go to war. It causes secession. And it turns into the cause, which we'll talk about by Lincoln and his actions. But it is not necessarily the entire cause that everyone is fighting for. However, it is the main thing that leads to war. Without it, there's no question that... if this wasn't one of the causes, there's no question in my mind that there would not have been a war. So the Civil War is caused by slavery, but it is also to preserve the Union. So South Carolina seceded, as you know, following the election of Lincoln by the remaining states, and they're followed by the remaining states after that election. And so it is Lincoln's goal and role to try to preserve the Union after these secessions. Buchanan was president when this happened. However, he felt that he could not. He felt that he didn't have the ability to stop the secession. He didn't think that it was constitutionally possible. Lincoln, however, felt that it was because he never saw it as a civil war. He saw it, and he didn't believe secession was legal. He saw it as a rebellion or an insurrection. He referred to it as such over the years. Let's talk about Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's aims were, again, to preserve the Union. To any extent that he did care about rights for blacks, it came second to his concern for preserving the Union. We'll talk more about that as we go. It may have come far less than that, right? But to any extent that was one of his concerns, it definitely came second to preserving the Union. So preserving the Union is number one. And he needed to appear as though he was not opposed to slavery because, remember, not all slaveholding states do secede from the Union. And so we see South Carolina is going to secede from the Union, followed by North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri are all going to remain in the Union. And he does not want to lose them. So he is going to not speak so harshly against slavery. So let's talk about black men who are going to volunteer and be rejected during this war. Blacks recognize that the outcome of the war was tied to the future of slavery. As the war goes on, that becomes very obvious. They began their own military groups and they began training in the North. Northern generals are going to assure Southern slave owners, however, that they would not interfere with slavery. So at first, the Union policy is that they will not try to get rid of slavery. That's not what they're doing. And that was the Union policy. So again, not everyone in the North is fighting to end slavery, especially right away. And some of them are a little upset that it does become that eventually. And so essentially, when pressed to return slaves, General Benjamin Butler is going to refuse because the law no longer applied to the South. So what that means is that there was a fugitive slave law that said the northern states had to return runaway slaves to the South. However, they're no longer in the Union, so the law no longer applies to them, according to General Butler. He declared that black slaves were contraband or enemy property. And General John C. Fremont defied the First Confiscation Act and freed all slaves belonging to Confederates in Missouri. Now, again, Lincoln does not want to go against slavery right away, and so because of that, he is going to rescind that order. So Lincoln's initial position on slavery is that he believed in compensated emancipation, which is paying slave owners for their slaves. So again, think about what that means, right? It suggests that if slave owners lose their slaves, they're losing their property, they're losing money, right? And so Lincoln figured that a way that they might go along with this is if they compensate them by paying for the slaves. And so he then also supported, which I should say about compensated emancipation, some rejected this notion because they don't want to attach the war to slavery. They don't want to attach this issue of emancipation at all. They don't want him to talk about emancipation because then it makes the war about slavery, and they don't want to do that right away. So again, right away, not necessarily what everyone, especially in the North, are fighting for. Others felt paying for slaves established them as property. So if they gave them money to compensate for them for property, it suggests that they really are property and they do need to be compensated. So then Lincoln is going to move to a plan to pay border states to gradually emancipate. And so the northern states have been gradually emancipating for years. Gradual emancipation means over time freeing slaves. The northern states have been doing this for years, and it's why they were free states by this time. So he is attempting to utilize something like that to attempt to achieve emancipation. But again, he's kind of softening on this idea of emancipating slaves. It's somewhere that he's moving, but people want him to kind of calm down on that talk because they don't want people to get super upset and attach this all and only to slavery. So he starts to shift, and his early proposals are failing. So he decides that the future of the Union and victory were directly tied to slavery. The only way, potentially, that they could preserve the Union, which was his main goal, was to end slavery. And he figured that the only way that victory would happen, the only way that slavery would be ended would be through victory. And so he realized that those two are inextricably linked, right? That they cannot be separated. And so he considered slavery in the summer of 1862, and he considered emancipation, and his cabinet essentially kind of talked him out of it. Let me stop. His cabinet was mostly in favor of it. One person was against it because it was an election, not an election year. It was an election year, but it was for Congress and not for president. And so they didn't want to lose Congress. And so Republicans and abolitionists, however, are going to attack him for not moving fast enough once they find out that he's thinking about it and doesn't actually do it. On September 22nd of 1862, Lincoln is going to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And so this is the first order. And essentially what he says is that by January 1st of 1863, all southern states and enslaved peoples in bondage in those states would be free. Okay? So all southern slaves in bondage states that are in rebellion, who have seceded, who are still in the Confederacy, their slaves would be free if the war ended at some point. Right? So that's a little complicated, but essentially saying if you stay in the Confederacy and we win, we are going to free your slaves. However, if you return to the Union, you can keep your slaves. right? The South doesn't bite. They expect to win. They believe they can win this war. We'll talk throughout why that is so, but they do. They believe they can win this war, and so there's no need to go back. They could have it both ways. They could win the war and potentially keep their slaves, which again, the South is 100% fighting for. The North is not necessarily right away fighting to end slavery, but the South is 100% fighting to keep it. So blacks and abolitionists start rejoicing, right? They're so excited that Lincoln is attempting to do this, and to them it means freedom. And so we start to see this, and we start to see some of those abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, who are celebrating and writing things about how Lincoln has freed the slaves. However, no one's freed yet, and some whites were upset that he was focused. They felt he was focused on the wrong thing. And we start to see anti-black riots flaring up in the North. In Cincinnati, for instance, when Irish dock workers invaded black neighborhoods, they were essentially upset that they were taking their jobs, and you're going to see riots there. In Brooklyn, Irish Americans are burning a tobacco factory that employed black women and children. So we see upset in the North, and I want to be clear again, right? Not everyone in the North is interested in ending slavery. They are not abolitionists. They are interested in preserving the Union at this point, and so they are going to remain upset at Lincoln for making this the focus of his campaign to preserve the Union. And as predicted, his party, the Republicans, remember that Lincoln was a Republican, and Republicans at the time were a party that was more left-leaning, and in this particular case, they are the party that is attempting to free the slaves. Democrats are the party that are attempting to keep the slaves, and so they are going to win several seats and governorships in the North, specifically New York and New Jersey, in these fall elections. And that's going to really upset some people because, again, the reason that this is happening, the reason people are changing is because they feel like the war is focused on the wrong thing and attempting to do the wrong thing. So let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamations, issued January 1st, 1863. Remember, preliminary was earlier in the year in 1862, and now on January 1st, 1863, that date that he promised, we have this happening. And so he does issue the Emancipation Proclamation. What it says is that people are free in the southern states who are in rebellion. So if you look at the map, and if we're looking at the map here, we see all of the Confederate states, including Tennessee and Arkansas. And then you see the border states. So this order does not free slaves in the border states. So in Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Washington, D.C., Delaware, and Maryland, you are not seeing any slaves being freed yet at this point. And of course, all of these kind of gray states, including out west and California, are free states. Oregon also is a free state. But all of these states, this is where slaves are now free. Now, it doesn't have an effect, as you see here, because these states are not in the Union. They are another country, or as they view themselves. So those slaves are not freed. In some cases, they don't hear about it. But when they do, we do see about 50,000 slaves free themselves, which is going to not be a huge number, but it is going to be significant that those who do hear about this and know about this see it as their freedom and their opportunity to be free. So it does not free 4 million slaves, but it does free right away 50,000 slaves. But what it does do, and this is significant, is establish slavery as the cause of the Civil War. So we could use cause in two different ways, right? We could use cause to say what led to it, right? What led up to the Civil War? Well, it's the issue over slavery. That's obvious, right? But what's the cause? As in, what are we fighting for? That's not established until the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years into the war, right? The cause now is slavery, right? What they're fighting for is now slavery. The proclamation is going to end any hope the South had of obtaining foreign aid. Why? Because no country wants to come into a war that is about freeing people versus keeping people enslaved and fighting on the side of keeping people enslaved, especially when most of those countries have already freed they're slaves, right? Most of them do not have slavery anymore. So no one wants to fight on the side of slavery. So it all but ends those hopes that the South has of getting foreign aid. And while it does not free enslaved people, they heard about it. They become less likely to fight or work alongside those attempting to enslave them. And we'll talk more about that. But essentially, they no longer are super willing to fight against or for the Confederacy.